Okay, so we are in the last 8 chapters of Exodus. We're getting ready to finish our second book of Torah. So this chapter, or this last section, could be divided into 2 major sections: the renewal of the covenant and I lost it. And the building the dwelling. Okay, so that's the 2 sections. So it's probably all familiar with you because you're all good students and you all read your homework assignment. So we'll start in with the introduction to chapter 32. So what you have going on in 32 to 34 is Moses is with God on Mount Sinai. People are turning against him. So Moses went up on the mountain again, second time, 40 days and 40 nights. 40, by the way, is a number that represents a time of testing. So Noah and his family were 40 days and 40 nights on the ark. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights, I should say. Moses twice now went up the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Can you think of anybody in the New Testament who spent 40 days and 40 nights being tested? Jesus in the temptation in the desert, right? So we see that period of 40 days and 40 nights being a recurring theme in the scriptures. The people think they know better than what God is asking them. So Moses is up the mountain. They're decided they're going to go on without Moses and without God. So they decide that they know better than the Lord does. They sin against the Lord and make false gods. So this is Moses up on the mountainside. In chapter 32, they make a false god. So they violate the first and most important of all the commandments. I am the Lord your God, and I'm your only God. So they don't wait till like one of number 7 or number 8 down the list. They go right for the top, and they sin against the Lord. Aaron, the brother of Moses, is complicit with the evil that they're performing, and he makes gods. The word that's actually used in the text in Hebrew is Elohim. And we know whenever you see a word in Hebrew that ends in I-am, it means plural, right? So they're making false gods for themselves that will go before them. There's some debate whether or not the calf was the god itself or the throne, because in that culture, in that time, there were other religions that used animals as thrones for their deity. So there's some debate whether or not the calf itself was meant to be their god or just the throne of their god. Not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but some other God. So Aaron participates in this. He declares the bulls, which is also very common in Eastern iconography, the gods that they brought with them from Egypt. So remember, gods are gods of a place, right? But this is now gods coming with them from Egypt. They break the law, and Moses in turn breaks the law, the 10 commandments, and destroys their idol. They're rejecting the covenant. Moses, though, doesn't want the covenant broken. So Moses intervenes on behalf of the Lord and on behalf of the people to the Lord to try and save them from God destroying them for being false to the covenant. So God, though, he does, at first he intends to destroy the people. So we have to kind of understand, we know that there is no changing with God. Because to say there's changing with God means there's a past and a present and a future with God. God did think this, God now thinks this, God will think that. Okay? That's not possible with God. God exists outside of time. But we have a hard time with understanding all of that. And so we tend to anthropomorphize God. We tend to assign human qualities to God, like the ability to change his mind. But there's no changing mind. But the author here doesn't understand all that. So the author is saying that God changed his mind when Moses spoke with him. So God relents. He does not annihilate the people like he did in the days of Noah. Very good. He does not do that, but he decides to continue to be their God. But we're going to see in a future chapter that he does it in a way different than he had been doing it to this point. So God does strike the unfaithful. Moses, as a true mediator, speaks up for them. Notice the 2 arguments. Did you catch the 2 arguments that Moses made to God? Why he shouldn't destroy the people? It was very brilliant on Moses' part. He does it for the sake of God, not for the sake of the people. Don't destroy them, because if you destroy them, what would the Egyptians say? Oh, he took them out to the desert just so he can destroy them there. Okay? Not for their sake, but for the sake of your name, so the Egyptians will not think badly about you, God. Don't destroy them, because the Egyptians will speak badly then. And what about the promise you made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? If you destroy all these people, you're going back on the promise you made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So not for the sake of the people, but for your sake, God, so that you're not known as a God who goes back on his word. Brilliant, isn't it? Moses doesn't, because he knows if he tries to make an argument in favor of the people, God's going to say, pfft. A, I don't need them. B, I can make more just like them. C, they turned their back on me. I didn't turn my back on them. So there is no argument he could make on behalf of the people. The only argument he can make is on behalf of God. Don't destroy them for your sake, not for theirs. Did you catch all that? I'm sorry? I wouldn't say conning him, but he's appealing to the qualities that we know about God. Yeah. So yeah, he's talking him into it for his sake. Yep. But it doesn't mean that the people don't have punishment for their sin. Okay, the people are punished. The tablets are broken. Since God offered covenant and the people responded, they have sinned. Not only have they broken the covenant, but they've apostatized. Apostatize means to deny their faith in God. In fact, in the early days of the church, the three greatest sins were considered murder, adultery, and apostasy. People denying their faith in God. The tablets are broken, symbolizing the covenant being broken, because the tablets symbolize the covenant. And Moses takes the powder, puts it in water, and makes them drink it as a punishment. Okay? That's what you see in verses 15 to 20. Aaron and Moses, it's interesting, are contrasted here about how they served the people. How does Aaron serve the people? He gives in to the bad things that they want and serves them by fashioning this calf, right? Moses serves the people by going and defending them before God and trying to stop God from killing them. So they're contrasted there. The Levites, remember there was 12 sons of Jacob. One of them was Levi or Levi. The Levites inflict the punishment. They're the ones that actually do the ritual of making the people drink this water. So they have become consecrated to God. They've been set apart already. We're seeing that the Levites, out of all the 12 tribes, are being set apart for something special in God's plan. Here it's God's punishment. Later on, we can see it's the sacrifices to God. Moses wins them forgiveness of their sins, but there will still be consequences. So that's Moses smashing the tablets. Remember that scene from History of the World? This is intentional. This is not just dropping one of them. So chapter 33, the people recognize now, because God has withdrawn some of his favor from them, they recognize his absence. This is coming from the Yahwist and Elohist tradition, that the people are lamenting God's absence. God promises again to give them their land. What's the covenant, right? Land and, children, descendants, right? So he repromises in chapter 33, in the early verses, that he will give them their land, he will clear out their enemies. But, big difference now, he's not going to go with them. Instead, he sends his angel to go with them. And now, remember I've said many times in the past, I said that in Torah, in the Yahwist and Elohist traditions especially, you see angel being used interchangeably for both God and a separate being that's God's messenger. So it could be the angel speaking to you, but it's God himself speaking to you, or it could be a separate being that is acting on God's behalf. This is the first time now where you're really seeing a clear distinction between the word angel being used for God and the word angel being used for his messengers as separate beings, okay? So God says, I'm not going to go with them, but my angel is going to go with them. So God can't be the angel, right? In that phrasing, he can't say, I'm not going to go with you, and I'm going to go with you as the angel. So no, there's two separate beings here now. It's very clear that. He will not be with them because he might get fed up with their disobedience, and he might get fed up with their unfaithfulness. So is it better for God to go with them and suffer their disobediences and their lack of fidelity? Or is it better for God to remain at a distance and not see them? Because if he sees it, he has to punish it. This is a great anthropomorphism here, right? This is because is there anything God doesn't see? Is God ever not present? No, he's omniscient. He's omnipresent, right? But this is an anthropomorphism. It's kind of like what you might say to your children or to somebody. Okay, if I go away and I leave you at home, I don't know what you're doing. But if I stay home, I know what you're doing. This is in essence what God is saying to the Israelites. If I travel with you, I might really get fed up with your infidelity and just wipe you all out. But if I send my angel to go with you instead, I won't get as upset with you. Again, it's a great anthropomorphism. It's ascribing human qualities to God. But this is what he says in the text. Yes?
When they built the tabernacle and the ark, didn't they take that all with them?
We haven't built it yet. In chapter 33, we haven't built it yet. It's coming up in chapter 35 and after that. Remember, he gave the instructions on how to do it, but they haven't done it yet. Okay, so we're only in chapter 33. So hold on to the thought. Okay? Moses is going before the Lord face to face as the leader of his people. This is different. It's not in lots. So remember we talked about the Urim and Thummim last time? The things that were in the priest's vestments that they used to cast lots to know God's will, okay? That's how God was present to the people, was in things like casting of lots. Or how did God make himself known to Joseph? No, that was Moses. Joseph. Think back to Genesis. How did God make himself known? In the dreams. So God at this point with everybody else is in dreams and in lots. But with Moses, he's face to face. There's no language, by the way, with the conversation with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that it was face to face. The closest thing we came to any kind of face to face was, remember, Abraham had 3 visitors. And remember the 3 visitors that we say were the members of the Holy Trinity. But the conversations were never described as face to face with Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. But they are now face to face with Moses. Okay? When Moses is talking to God face to face, the text tells us the leaders of the people stood at the fronts of their tents and prayed. So while Moses was talking to God, while he was praying on behalf of the people are joining him in prayer, not at Sinai, not up on the mountain, but at the doors of their tents. But there's kind of this unity that they're praying with him at the same time he's talking to God. Okay? It's kind of like what we see at Mass. We have one priest that's offering the sacrifice, everybody's praying with him. Right? Not everybody's saying the Eucharistic prayer. One is saying the Eucharistic prayer, but we're all joining that one in praying at that moment. And that's kind of what's going on here. Moses is the one talking to God face to face, but all the leaders of the people are standing at their tents joining him in prayer. Notice they all don't come up Mount Sinai. I know a priest who tells people, come stand around the altar. Well, we are already around the altar. This is around the altar, and that's around the altar, and that's around the altar. You don't have to come stand where you can actually touch the altar. So they lament God's absence, and then they have the placing of the dwelling, verses 7 through 11. The meeting tent is placed outside the camp. Okay? Placed outside the camp. That's important. Why outside the camp? Because he's not with the people in the camp. Again, he's putting some distance now because he doesn't want to see their unfaithfulness. So God is absent, symbolized by the meeting tent being outside the camp now, not in the camp. And then there's this theophany. Theophany, I think I mentioned last time, is a word that means a manifestation of God. God shows himself somehow. He can show himself by creating a miracle. He can show himself by forces of nature. He can show himself as an angel. He can show himself in lots and lots and lots of different ways. But whenever he shows himself, that's called a theophany. Okay? There was a theophany at the Jordan River we just had 2 weeks ago on Sunday at the baptism of the Lord. That was a theophany. The Magi, we call it Epiphany, and there's another reason for that, but that was a theophany as well. The wedding feast at Cana, when Jesus shows his divinity by changing water into wine, that's a theophany. So there can be lots and lots of different kinds of theophanies. Okay? Jesus is the great, perfect theophany because he says, when you see me, you've seen the Father. So that's fully manifesting God to us. Excuse me. So Moses asks the Lord for his favor. God says, yes, I will be with you. But Moses asks, may I see your glory? So God knows you can't see the fullness of my glory and live. It's beyond your ability to take in the fullness of my glory. So God, of course, has no body. So what he does is he manifests himself, tells Moses to hide himself in the cleft of the rock. That's Moses over here. That's his face and his hair and his beard, hiding in the cleft of the rock, and God is passing away, symbolized by that bright light. That's the closest that God can fully manifest himself to Moses. And Moses is the true mediator. I mean, look what we've seen. We've seen Moses interceding for the people. We've seen to God, and we've seen Moses interceding to God for the people. You've seen it both directions, right? So Moses is the perfect mediator at this point. There's going to be another one who's going to be an even better mediator later on, but it'll take 1,000 years before that happens. Okay, that's chapter 33. Chapter 34, there are new tablets of stone in verses 1 through 9. God offers a new set of tablets, the renewal of the covenant received on Mount Sinai. And God descends to write the tablets, and he's glorified in verse number 6. So this covenant is renewed. Same terms as chapters 20 to 23. So if you want to do that, you can look back at chapter 34 and look at chapters 20 to 23, and you can see how the covenant is the same. Except now there's one more, the redemption of the firstborn. So the firstborn child has to be redeemed. Think of redeemed not in the way we tend to think about it as being saved from death. That's not really what redemption means. Some of us are probably old enough to remember S&H green stamps. Remember green stamps? And you kept the books, you got them at different places, and you kept the books and you turned them in for stuff. What did you do with the book when it was full? What did you do with the book when it was full? What did your parents do with the book when it was full? I'm sorry? You turned it into where? What was it called? It was called a redemption center, an S&H redemption center. And you redeemed it for merchandise or for whatever, okay? That's the idea of redemption we need to keep in mind. It's like the S&H green stamps, okay? It's a buying back, okay? So when we say Jesus redeems us, he bought us back. He in essence, paid for us. How did he pay for it? With his life. But that's what redemption means. It's that exchange. I'm going to give you something, and you're going to give me something in return. I'm buying this merchandise back through my S&H green stamps. I'm buying these people back through my death on the cross. I'm buying these people back through this redemption that happens in chapter 34, where the covenant is renewed and the people are redeemed. Now there's a command for the redeeming of the firstborn. You have to buy back your firstborn child from God. Because who has a right to that child? Even more than the parents do? God does. Why? Because God created that child. He used the parents in a physical way to do it, but whose child is it? It's God's child. And so God says, I want you to redeem every firstborn of your children. This is where circumcision comes in. Okay? So the firstborn has to be redeemed. This is a new term of the covenant that wasn't part of the covenant in chapters 20 to 23. God says, don't make covenants with the people you encounter and with their gods. So remember, gods are gods of a place, usually. So they're going to be traveling through these people's lands on the way back to the promised land. They're going to encounter other people. Don't make covenants with those people. You're not to make covenants with them. You make covenants with me and me alone. And don't make covenants with their gods. You make covenant with the one true God, me, and that's it. So he gives them that warning. Only males can be circumcised.
Right, but I mean,
every male as part of the covenant has to be circumcised. Otherwise, you ain't part of the covenant.
So that doesn't show any differentiation between the
Firstborn has to be, but they all have to be circumcised later on. But right now, it's the command. We're taking things that are happening after the exile and putting them back into this time. At this time, in this covenant, what we're told is the firstborn has to be redeemed. Later on, it'll be every male is supposed to be circumcised, because that male has to be part of the covenant, because when he marries and has his own children, if they're going to be part of the covenant, he has to be part of the covenant. But that's later on. Good connection, though. And then we're told at the end of that section that Moses writes what God tells him to write. So you have two different sets of language going on here. On one hand, God is writing the commandments. On the other hand, God is telling Moses what to write. And in this section of Exodus, you're hearing both. So this is one of the reasons why they say maybe there was two different authors, because one author is saying God wrote it the second time as well as the first time, and another author is maybe saying that God this time didn't write it himself, but he told Moses what to write. But that is in the text there. And Moses is changed by the encounter. All last year I preached about the encounter with God through all the different seasons and all the feast days. And I said how we're supposed to be changed by the encounter. Well, verses 29 to 35 tell us that Moses was physically at least changed by the encounter with God. His face becomes radiant. So you see there, you got all these rays coming off his head. Okay? So his face becomes radiant. In Hebrew, the word for radiant is also the word for horned. So like a rhinoceros is horned. Satan, we imagine, is horned. So the word in Hebrew can mean either one. When St. Jerome translated the Greek into the Latin, he kept the word for horned, not the word for radiant. And so artists continue to depict that Moses has horns. It's like there's that very famous statue of Moses by Michelangelo. It's on display in a church in Rome, where Moses is sitting down, he's got the book of the law, and he's got his hand up, and he's got horns sticking out of his head. Okay? That's not because he was a devil child or because he was a pan or anything like that. It's because the word for horned and the word for radiant are the same word. And so artists have taken that Latin text where they use the word horned and done things like, it's not so bad there, but you even hear, if you look at it closely, he's got two great big rays of light coming up this way like horns, and then he's got three smaller ones. But so that's what some of the artists will do. So if you ever see a picture of Moses, it looks like he has horns. It's not because he was some kind of mutant. It was because of the translation of the word horned and radiant through history. And then he would wear a veil when he wasn't speaking with God or for God. He would wear a veil over his face because he didn't want to make it uncomfortable for the people to talk to him, because his face had been changed. His countenance had been changed. Okay? That's 32 through 34. So you can see the covenant renewed in that text, in those chapters. Okay. So now, getting back to Sharon's point, we had the instructions before. Last week we saw the instructions on how to build everything. Now we see the actual building of everything. Okay? So in chapters 35 through 40, we see the building of the dwelling and all the appointments in it. And then as far as the ministers and how they're actually ordained, and then God comes to dwell in the dwelling tent. So they're carrying out the divine command from chapters 25 to 32, and so they build the dwelling. First, we have these Sabbath regulations established on what they can do and what they can't do on the Sabbath. It's supposed to be a day of remembrance of God's creation. They get ready to build. The offerings are brought from the people. And the ones that are going to do the artisanship, the building, the craftsmanship are blessed by God. So that's chapter 35. Chapter 36, the dwelling tent is established. I'm wondering, Debbie, can you turn off? There's two switches on that wall that are off and two that are on. The one next to the two that are off, turn that one off as well, please. That one, yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is the dwelling tent inside. Notice there's like a fence around it, right? Okay. And so then you've got these different layers of veils. You have the outer veil. I think we talked last time that there was an inner veil and an outer veil. The outer veil separates the dwelling from outside the dwelling, and the inner veil separates the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant will be kept. So if you read the text, it talks about ram's skins dyed red, badger skins dyed blue, goat hair, which we said last time, the scholars say the actual translation was more like dolphin hair than it was, or dolphin skin than goat skin. And the first covering was embroidered with the cherubims. That's the angels that are next to the throne of God. Yes?
In the tabernacle today, are there still, I think I remember as a foster boy that there used to be two arms that had cloth arms before.
This tabernacle was purchased in somewhere around 1978, and it was designed without an outer veil. It was designed with an inner veil. When I got here, there wasn't one on the tabernacle, but we had somebody make one, so now there's an inner veil on the tabernacle again. But this one doesn't have the hardware to it to put an outer veil, because it was made at a time when people didn't think that was important, so they didn't do it. So that's the dwelling tent. So chapter 36 talks about the tent being built, the coverings, the frames, and the adornments for the actual tent itself. Okay. Then you've got the chapter 37, the making of the Ark of the Covenant. So this is, remember we said this was 45, I think it was. Well, this is like 2.5 cubits, and this is 1.5 cubits. So this is a square across this way and up and down, and then this side's longer. And this is the poles that have to be carried because you can't touch it. And then, of course, the propitiatory on top with the angel wings covering it. So remember, inside goes the tablets, but God dwells up here. God doesn't dwell inside the box. Okay? So that's the Ark of the Covenant, chapter 36. In chapter 36, we also see them making the table, that the bread goes on, one loaf for each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and then the glass of wine and some other things go on the table. This is not inside the Holy of Holies, because only the Ark is inside the Holy of Holies. This is in the between the two veils. This is the incense stand, and this is the candle, what they call it the candle stand, I think. Lampstand, that's what they called it. The lampstand, we usually refer to it as the menorah. So those things are actually built in chapter 37, along with the consecration of the anointing oil, which we talked about again last week. Chapter 38, we see the building of the altar of sacrifice. So the animals, the cereal grain that are going to be sacrificed get burned on top of here. And then this is the laver, or the wash stand. So that's built in chapter 38, those two things. And then in chapter 39, yeah, it didn't come out very good. It's too small. Chapter 39 has the making of the vestments of the priest. And I'm going to see if I can describe these two and see it on here. So the top of his head is the white as the turban, and then underneath it is the crown. On his shoulders are the two onyx stones that they talk about in the text. Next to his skin is the linen tunic, which is like our alb. The ephod is the thing that's going around his body. There's a pocket in it, and that's where the Urim and Thummim are kept, the lots. The breastplate has the 12 stones, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. There's the blue robe that he wears. That'll be similar to like our chasuble in the Roman Rite. And then underneath, you don't see him because he's got his clothes covering him. It's the linen pants, or what do they call them in the text that I read? They called them the drawers. So like the undergarment, okay? So you see in chapter 39, the making of the vestments and the completion of the rest of the work of building the dwelling tent. So again, everything we saw in 32 to 20, what chapters was that? Something at 31, 25 to 31, is that what it was? We saw all those last week, the description of what God wanted. Now we see them all being made. Chapter 40, gives us the dedication rites. Was anybody ever at a dedication of a church? Have you ever been at a dedication of a Catholic church? There's pretty extensive rites. So let's say when this church was built and it was dedicated, the doors of the church were locked. The bishop would come up there and knock on the doors, and somebody inside would let him in. All the people would follow him inside. The first thing he had to do was bless water, make holy water, because you were going to need holy water for a lot of things in that liturgy. So there was a ritual of blessing water and then sprinkling not only the people, but the altar and the walls and everything was sprinkled with holy water. Okay. There was then reading of scripture for the first time. Then they would bring chrism, the same chrism that's put on our foreheads when we got confirmed. Many of us were probably anointed with chrism also when we were baptized. I was anointed my hands with chrism when I was ordained a priest. The altar is consecrated by smearing chrism all over it. And the walls are actually anointed with chrism too. So in 12 spots around the church, there was an anointing of the walls as well. The altar, incense was then prepared, and usually on a wooden altar like this, that's why it used to be stone altars, at least the top had to be stone, because they would literally light incense on the altar top. They'd put a hot lit charcoal on the altar top and sprinkle incense on it, and that would be incensing the altar, making it sacred. With wooden ones, they'll put it in a flame-retardant, heat-proof bowl and burn that on top of it so they don't ruin the altar. But there's all these rituals. The candles being lit for the first time, there's all kinds of rituals in a dedication of a church because we're setting up that building aside for a sacred purpose, not for anything else. This is why I always tell people, it's like, no, it's not the same to have Mass in your house. It's not the same. Your house was not consecrated and set apart just for God. That building was. And so all of these rituals, this is all, they have to be dedicated so that all of this is dedicated to God, and it's not for anything else. They're not going to use the Holy of Holies for a courtroom. They're not going to use it for wedding dinners. This is set apart. This is for nothing but for God.
Is the meeting tent outside the fence?
No, it's outside the camp, but it's not outside the fence. The meeting tent is the dark thing in the middle there. Right here. That's the meeting tent. Okay. So they describe in chapter 40 the dedication on the first day of the first month, the month of Nisan, the month, by the way, that we saw earlier in Exodus. On the 14th day of Nisan was when they do what? Think back to what they did right before they left Egypt. I know it was before Christmas. What did they do right before they left? The Passover meal, right? They slaughtered the lambs and sprinkled the blood on their doorposts, right? That was on the 14th of Nisan. So Nisan is a very important month. It's the month of Passover. It's 9 months now after arriving at Sinai. That's when they're doing all this, okay? Once it was all built and dedicated, God came into the tent and filled it. That's a very interesting metaphor. God's presence filled the tent, okay? Imagine what fills this room more than anything else. Air, right? Air fills this room. Is there any place in this room where there's no air? No. Okay? Except for the space occupied by other molecules. There's no place without air. So if you say God's presence filled the tent, that means every inch of it, every square centimeter of it had the presence of God in it. And if God's filling the tent, what is there no room for else? Anything else, right? Because God's presence has filled the tent. If I bring something in here, let's say I bring another table in here from another room, air has to leave, right? There's only so much volume of space in this room. So if I bring something in, something has to leave. Okay? So God's presence fills the tent. The only way that anything else can come into that tent is if God somehow allows that space to be occupied by somebody else. So once a year when the priest goes in to offer the sacrifice, God has to allow him to come in by making himself a little less present because he's filling the tent. There's no room for anything else. And that's the way it's supposed to be. Because when God is the center of our lives, there's no room for anything else other than what God commands of us, other than what God wants us to do. So I thought that was a very important verse there that says, God's presence filled the tent. There's no room for anyone or anything else unless God makes room for that person to come in. People have said that, even non-Catholics have said that when they walk into a Catholic church, they feel like somebody's there. That there's a presence, even if they don't know what it is. Well, there is a presence, because even when we're not there, somebody is there in a Catholic church, the Lord. That's what that little red candle means. He's here all the time. He's not just here when we're here. I think I've mentioned this in preaching before, that there was a day I had to do something in the back behind the sanctuary, and I had to go back to my office. And I was walking through the church, and I hear in my mind, I am God, you know. Are you going to show me some respect before you walk through my church? So I turned around and genuflected, and I said, yes, I know you're God. Genuflected and walked out. There was nobody there to see it, except the one who needed to see it, the Lord. And so we have the same thing going on here, that God's presence fills that space. Even the people who don't know it, they feel a presence when they walk into that room, like there's somebody there, because there is somebody there. The tent becomes the place where God and people meet. Now, what did we say about Moriah? And what did we say about Sinai? That's the place where God and people meet, right? The mountain. Remember, Moriah was where Abraham was going to slaughter Isaac, and God intervened there and met him there. God met Jacob at the foot of the mountain. God met Moses at Mount Sinai. The people came and met God at Mount Sinai, but they can't stay at Mount Sinai. They're not going to just take over the Sinai Peninsula. There's a promised land God wants them to go to. So God has two choices. He could stay at Sinai, or he could somehow go with them. So now the meeting tent, the dwelling tent, is the place where God and people meet. So it becomes like a portable Mount Sinai. Because now they don't have to go to Sinai to talk to God. God is coming with them. Not in the same way he was before, but he's still leading them, and his angel is leading them. It says in the text, when God would leave the tent, it was time to move on. Otherwise, they stayed where they were. So this smoke is representative of the presence of God. So when the smoke left the tent, that means it was time to pack up and move to the next place we're going to. As long as he stayed in the tent, they stayed there. So God is directing their coming and going by his presence in the dwelling, the meeting tent. Okay? So with this image, think about where we've come in the book of Exodus. That family of Jacob came down to Egypt because of famine and stuff, and they stayed there and they became populated. The people enslaved them. They cried out to God. God rescued them from their slavery and renewed the promise he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give you a promised land. I will give you a land, and I will give you descendants. He brings them out of slavery. He glorifies himself in that theophany at the Red Sea, when he parts the Red Sea and they pass through on dry land. That was a theophany. That was a manifestation of God. Okay? He brings them to Sinai because he wants to enter into a formal covenant with them. Remember we talked about with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he's establishing a family. Now he's establishing a nation. Okay? At Sinai, he offers the terms of establishing a nation. They turn their back on him. He reestablishes covenant with them, promises to dwell among them and to lead them into this promised land. And he does so with all this talk about building tents and tables and lampstands and all this stuff. So what are we poised now to do? He's established his nation. Now he wants to lead his nation to the land he's promising them. And that's what we're going to see in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We're going to see him bringing the people there and what happens along the way. Because Adam and Eve failed in their relationship with God, but he didn't abandon them. Cain failed in his relationship with God, but God didn't abandon him. The people with Noah had failed in their relationship with God. The people who built that tower in Babel had failed in their relationship with God, but he didn't abandon them. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all in their own ways, had times when they failed in their relationship with God, but he didn't abandon them. Now we see the Israelites coming out of Egypt. They fail in their relationship with God. They're going to fail a whole bunch more times, but he doesn't abandon them. So for us as Christians especially, we can see great hope in all of this. No matter how many times we mess up, God's not going to ever abandon us. We might abandon him, just like all those people I just named had their times when they abandoned him, but he will never abandon us. He will always continue to offer relationship to us as long as we accept it. And so now these people are getting ready to go to that land that he promised them, to become the nation that he promised that they would be, and the trials that they have along the way, and the commands that he wants them to keep so they can stay in right relationship with him. That's what we're going to see in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay? All right. Why don't we go into our little table discussions?